So welcome to our Bible study for Niles First Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. Today is October 17th, and we are continuing our study on the Bible. Last week we had a basic overview of what Scripture is, of how to approach it. Today we'll begin to talk about some of the parts of it and how we can read those parts differently. So thank you if you're gathering with us online. Feel free to jump in with any questions. Thank you for joining us in person. And if you're following along with this, either from our Facebook page or our YouTube page, make sure to, what are we supposed to say? Like and comment, subscribe, do those things that you're supposed to. But engage in some way. We're happy you're joining with us, whatever way that you are. So last week we talked a lot about hermeneutics and exegesis, and that's going to play some part into what we're going to talk about today, which is the very beginning chunk of the Bible as we have it. We talked on Sunday about the law and what laws we are called to follow, but more so I want to talk today about the nature of law and how it is developed specifically in the Torah. So the Torah as we have it, generally when we talk about law, we talk about it interchangeably with the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch or the Torah. So that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which is interesting because we named Genesis in the law, but there's no commands in Genesis. Most of the laws, the commands that we have, the mitzvot, that we see are in books 2 through 4, some in 5 as well. So, but it's completely spurious the way we designate the books. It's really just a tradition from the way that the scrolls, there's only so much that can fit on a scroll. So there has to be some delineation there. We call it the law, and really Torah is the Hebrew word for law. But if you read it through, if you read Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, most of it isn't law. Most of it's narrative. You get some of the best stories in Scripture in these first 5 books. They're the stories that make good storytelling. We don't quite have that level of storytelling, of narration, in the rest of the Bible, really. I mean, we have some other books in the writings, like Ruth is a great story, Esther is a great story. In the New Testament, they're much shorter. There's not the drawn out narratives of events and timelines. Acts to some degree, but it's still pretty truncated in the way that it tells the story. That's shorter narratives, shorter development. So why do we call the first 5 books the law if only about half of it is the law? Mostly it's the stories of how the law came to be. It's part of the ancestral narrative of why the law is held in esteem. But there's
somebody doing something bad that needs corrected to get a law,
right?
So gotta have all that part in there too.
You got to have the story of why we need the law in the first place. Oh, I like that. And that's a lot of what the narratives are. It's well, and really that's a lot of what the New Testament is too. Instead of prescriptive, it's descriptive, the nature of law and covenant and command. You see that in, well, most of Paul's writing to the churches. He's saying, okay, y'all are doing a great job, kind of, but listen to a way you can do it better. That's really what 1st and 2nd Corinthians is how to be church because you're not quite being church right now. We need those laws because sometimes we need to be told what is right. Okay. Maybe. No?
Maybe. I think most people know what's right. It's just a matter of wanting to do it.
That's fair. That's maybe that's a base conversation that we should have because we're talking about the nature of humanity. Theological anthropology is one of the studies, one of the specific categories of developing a constructive or systematic theology. And if we have to figure out what this, for us as Christians, if we need to figure out what exactly Christ did that saves us, well, we need to figure out what we needed to be saved from, right? This is atonement theory that we've gone through before. So whether taking a position that we know what is good inherently, but struggle to follow through with it, would be different than taking a position that, like extreme total depravity in Calvinism, that no matter what we do, we're not going to be able to follow the law or bring about good with our fallen state. Or you could, I mean, and all of these arguments fit within the umbrella of historical Christianity as well as historical Judaism. The nature of humanity and how we relate to God's law is a debate that's still being waged, and rightfully so, because we don't quite have an answer yet. There's a lot of different humans, and we're all unique, which makes trying to put us all under an umbrella very, very difficult. It is good that we're unique and we can celebrate those uniquenesses, but making a carte blanche statement about the nature of humanity as we relate to God often falls short, as do any pithy statements. They can't capture the nuance. They can't capture the deviations from that statement. So is that, I tend to agree with you, Bonnie. I think people are generally good. I've said that before from the pulpit and from study positions. I think that people are generally good, but I think we get really confused really easily. I think it's really difficult to tell what is the good path. I think ideally we know what is right and what is wrong when we draw it in hypothetical terms. Right? We can say don't murder. Oh yeah, I agree with that. That's generally a good rule. I can do that. But if I were to be drafted, I would suddenly have a different conversation about what that means. Okay, does that mean I participate? Is that technically murder? All of a sudden I have to question, oh geez, what is murder? Is that different from ending a life in self-defense? Is that different from protecting a defenseless person? Is that, what is the nature of, and how does that fit into these? So suddenly one rule, don't murder, has all these offshoots about, well, don't murder here. Definitely don't murder right now. Don't murder at this point in time. Maybe later, though, if this happens in this specific way, maybe it's okay. So we get conversations around just war theory. We get conversations around euthanasia. We get conversations around abortion. We get conversations around all these things, which fall under that umbrella of thou shalt not murder. But they turn a lot more gray as soon as it becomes a specific issue or a specific situation. So it's easy to see how, well, when we think of law, when we think of compiling the law, not just from a Christian perspective, but when we think of a compilation of the law in the Torah, what do we usually think of? I'm guessing that most Christians will go to 10 commandments. Yeah. We have a tendency to think of them as 10. There are 613 that have been generally agreed upon. Again, depending on interpretation. But they were developed, at least the list of 613 were put together in around 1000 CE by one individual, which I can't imagine. Sometimes I struggle to get 15 minutes sermon, so I can't imagine compiling the entirety of the mitzvot found. And mitzvot is command. Command would be the best translation of that. A mitzvah. Mitzvah is one command. Mitzvot is the plural, encompassing the 613 that were basically established or agreed upon around 1000. Which is interesting because we figure if the Torah began to be developed, okay, we're going to have to do a little bit of exegesis here, and it's going to share our theology, but it's called Mosaic law, right? Because traditionally it came from Moses, from Mount Sinai, directly from God. If you have a very literal, very conservative reading, you have no problem with that Moses came down, that Moses was a historical figure, that Moses came down with these commandments, and that they were pretty much codified when he came down from Mount Sinai. Because I mean, who's going to argue that, right? He comes down with 600 rules and his face is glowing. I mean, no one's going to be like, well, I'm not really sure. I think he made some of these up. So that's kind of a literal reading. On the other side, that you would get from Reform Judaism is that, or a more liberal progressive Christianity. The arguments that I'm talking about that relate specifically to Christianity are reflected as well in Jewish tradition between Orthodox and Reform.
Us that God gave Moses 613 laws when he was up on the mountain with him.
So I'm not saying that, but I'm saying one interpretation of this is that when Moses came down from Sinai, he had the fullness of the commands of God. And those are established.
It was more than just the 10 Commandments.
Yeah. Well, have you ever seen History of the World Part 1? When he comes down, he has 3 tablets, and I'm telling you, people, here are the 10 commandments, and it's excellent. Oh, it's excellent. Good Jewish humor. So the tradition is that these are the covenant that was given to Moses by God in the couple times he went up to Mount Sinai during their time in the wilderness. But even then, the story goes that they didn't follow it. Moses came down to his brother having a golden calf, and he was named as the prophet. And anyway, that's when we talk about prophets on Sunday, I'll get into that a little bit. But another interpretation is that this is Reform Judaism would see the mitzvot as inspired by God, but not direct command from God. Maybe in the same way that a lot of folks in our church would see Scripture as inspired by God, but not written by God. And I think that difference is really worth naming, because inspired, even as direct revelation, but written by humans, has a very different severity to how we follow that law, as opposed to God directly commanding these things and writing them down without error, right? So when we interpret or when we do exegesis of Scripture, we take in mind that there is an opportunity for the nature of translation, of time, of culture, everything we talked about last week. There's an opportunity for misunderstandings, mistakes, or contradictions to be entered. And that's generally, I think, the way most of our folks would take that. But that wouldn't, having conversations with other branches of Christianity, that's heresy. The way we view Scripture is sinful, depending on who we're talking to. Judaism's the same way. So depending on who you're talking to, if you're talking about to a devout Orthodox Jew, they're going to have a very different opinion about the nature of the mitzvot and how to follow them than you would even classical Reform Judaism, which has a bit more of a interpretive flair to it. You would compare Reform Judaism kind of to progressive Christian branches, where Orthodox Judaism would be more like evangelical holiness, literalist kind of. So for Orthodox Jewish folks, it is the goal to follow through with all 613 of those mitzvot, to know them well enough to know if you're living them and following through with them.
I'm not familiar with what is and what isn't one of those mitzvot.
Well, the good news is,
okay,
I got 613 of them here for you. A good question. Good question.
I was going to say, do those laws, are they including like when you sacrifice, what you sacrifice? And
partially, yes. Yep.
Well, people don't follow that anymore.
Right. Well, so here's the problem with this. A lot of those mitzvot are directly concerned with temple worship. And if there's no temple to worship at, then they can't be fulfilled, which you run into some big problems.
They're thinking the temple with the capital T, not the temple that's out on Market Street.
Right. So rabbinical Judaism came about after the fall of the temple. Rabbinical Judaism even used beyond the Torah rabbinical. So after the fall of the temple, you know, the living into the Mosaic Code, living into the, you know, the Torah would have been established as canon at that point. They would have been following those 5 books. After the fall of the temple, of the Second Temple, with the Roman Empire, there was a move to rabbinical Judaism, where since there is no temple, all we can do is have teachers that kind of lead in these different places. It became a diasporic religion rather than a geographically central religion like it was with the temple. You know, during the temple period, you're required to pilgrimage to Judaism, to Jerusalem 3 times a year with the Shalot Regalim. Once that's done, you can't. You can still go to Jerusalem, but you're going to run into issues with even approaching the Temple Mount. So some of the mitzvot actually say if you are unclean in certain ways, you can't go to the temple. The temple is the one place that can make you make you clean if you are ritually unclean. It's a paradox then that there can't be right. So even in the development of rebuilding, when there's talk about rebuilding the temple on the Temple Mount, you got to have some unclean folks to build it. There's a big catch-22 with the mitzvot as to how to do that. And then you get into, and then Christians start weighing in about saying how it's going to happen with, you know, because we think we know better than the folks that originally established this stuff, but that's not, I want to get into that. So there's, we find in, generally agreed, there's 613 commandments, mitzvot. You can see how some of them relate to God. I don't know if, Pagelin, if you're still there, maybe you can see that document and, read along with us there. Some of them relate to God, some Torah, signs and symbols, prayers and blessings, how to deal with the indigent, how to treat Gentiles, how to participate in marriage, divorce, family, a lot about sexual relations, a lot about how to deal with family, dietary laws, business practices, how to treat employees, or servants or slaves, as it would have been written, how to deal with vows, oaths, swearing, how to deal with being in court, how to deal with property rights, damages and injuries, criminal law, punishment, idolatry, prophecy, animal husbandry, clothing, firstborn. There's a whole section on firstborn, how to deal with the priestly class, like the Levites, how to deal with tithes and taxes, which are seen as the same thing, which is really interesting, that tithes and taxes are viewed as the same. How to deal with the temple, sacrifices, and see how many, towards the end of the document, how many of the commands, the mitzvot, are related to sacrifices and offerings. Most of those are out the window just because there's no temple. Ritual, purity and impurity, name some of those things. What to do with a king, how to deal with leprosy. Again, not an issue we run into very frequently. How to deal with war. Nazarites are a specific group of preordained. Preordained is kind of the word I guess I would use. So like Samson was a Nazarite. Nazarites are folks that are set aside from birth to live differently, and those are some of the laws that would govern how they're set aside, and what the regulations and requirements are. So some of the things you're never going to run into, even if you tried to follow all these mitzvot. Some of these things, as a person in this current era, would never have to deal with.
It's redundant, some of it.
Some of it, yeah.
I mean, look at 593 and 594. Nazarite shall permit his hair to grow, that the Nazarite shall not cut his hair.
Mm-hmm.
If he doesn't cut his hair, he's permitting it to grow.
Part of that, there is a focus on whether whether a command is prohibitive or whether it's affirming. So the nature of those two would be seen as different, and one is a negative. It's prohibiting an action, and the other is saying
like
what?
The first 5 of the 10 commandments, thou shalt do
right
this.
Exactly.
And the next 5 is thou shalt not
mm-hmm.
do this.
Mm-hmm. So looking through some of this, I think this is going to take the majority of our time. For obvious reasons. we can clear through this in a half hour, right?
Okay.
But it's interesting to note that a lot of this code is unique in the ancient world, because they are commands from God. When you look at other ethical systems or other codes of conduct that were available at this time, they're mostly about how to deal with business practices, how to deal with interrelated interpersonal activities. So the ones that we would look at would be the Sumerian code of Ur-Nammu, which was around 2100 BCE, or Code of Hammurabi, Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, which was 1760 BCE. Code of Hammurabi is almost entirely, half of it is about contracts, about business contracts. This is very different. This has a very different feel than, how to sell your weighted copper. It's different than how to go back on a contract. It's included in here, and you can see other civilizations' influence on these mitzvot. But these are very different because these are seen as God ordained, not just how to deal with each other, best practices.
Yes.
Anything sticking out to you in any of these? And if you're joining us later, feel free to pick some of these up. We'll have them available in the parlor, the list of the mitzvot that you can take a look at and see how many you follow.
I'm not I don't even know the word. Number 18. TZI.
Yeah, tzitzi. They're braids or fringes.
Okay.
You see them on prayer shawls in modern Judaism. But that was a command. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. That all your clothes have to have little. Look at us. We don't have any little. I have a prayer shawl. I can show you the tzitzi.
That's what's up on the communion table.
No, that's actually a baby wearing blanket from Guatemala, I believe. I would have to double check.
Okay.
And we used it a little bit when Ellie and Theo were just teensy, but you grow out of those real quick. No, the prayer shawl that I use is the one that when I was portraying Jesus last year, the blue and the white with the fringes. Those are the tzitzit. A lot of this makes sense, and they make it sense, I think, specifically for a community. So think about how these laws and these mitzvot would have been developed. This is during a long period of time where an entire nation, a community, is trying to preserve their identity in the face of larger empires, in the midst of turmoil and intergenerational strife. Think about how the church has changed from generation to generation in just the past couple generations. Now imagine this over a period of hundreds of years. Imagine this in development as the culture around them is rapidly shifting, and they're trying to remain with their own identity as well. So some of the things like, Torah 13, to cleave to those who know him, to learn the Torah and teach it, to honor the old and wise. Those would function not so much as ancestral worship, but we need to learn from the folks that come before us so that we know who we are, what's our identity. Hang out with people that believe the same things. Be with people that know God. Don't add to the commandments of the Torah, whether in written law or in its interpretation received by tradition. Now, this is interesting because even in the rabbinical tradition, as after the fall of the temple, within the rabbinical tradition, became an acceptance of oral tradition and law, to the point that the primary document that was followed was not the Torah, but the Talmud, which is other generational writings that were put together by rabbis that taught a more pertinent interpretation of what it meant to be Jewish at that time. You see that through the Middle Ages, up until Reform Judaism came along, and Reform Judaism tried to go back to the Torah, and while giving room to take the mitzvot as they see fit, because Reform Judaism would say that some of these things were written to the culture and don't necessarily apply to us anymore, or to them, I should say. So things even like circumcision are seen as optional, although you do see a lot of these traditions continue. Mezuzahs are still a very important part to a lot of Jewish folks. Mezuzah is, if you go to my office, you'll see that there's a little box on the side of the wall, on the side of the door frame.
Yes.
It has a chunk of the Torah in it, part of Deuteronomy, that's bind it to your door frames, write it on your forehead, basically never forget who you serve.
Watch Ben-Hur again
Oh,
recently, and every time he went back to his home, there was that little box that he touched before he went into the.
That would be it. Yep.
Yeah.
And when you touch it, you're supposed to say the Shema. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Behold, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Oh, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.
And how about this number 16 one, that every person shall write a scroll of the Torah for himself?
Yeah.
You have to sit down and copy 5 books of the Bible.
So now think about that. Even think about how each one of these rules has some interpretation to it. Does that mean I can type it out? Because I'm a much quicker typer. My handwriting, I wouldn't be able to read what I had just written.
Well, these were given back when there wasn't a typewriter.
That's right. But you can see how that rule would apply to strengthen the community. If you're copying something by hand and you're paying attention to make it legible and you're being careful and cautious with it, you're gonna know at least a chunk of it by the time you're done writing.
Yeah. Oh yeah, if I write something out, I learn it better.
Yep.
I remember.
I do too.
Remember it better. That's why if I'm learning something new, okay, let me do it. Don't just show me how, let me do it. And then
Right.
I learn better that way.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of these things you'll still see if you're watching video of Orthodox Jewish folks in Israel right now. You'll see like 19 and 20. You'll see the tefillin on them. It's kind of like a little box that kind of gets strapped on, and again, it has parts of the Torah on it.
I've seen them on their own menu.
Yep, that's the tefillin. To read the Shema in the morning and night, which I just named with the mezuzah. Pray during meals. Things, a lot of them, we would look at this and say, well, this is what makes a good person. Don't cherish hatred in one's heart. Don't take revenge. Don't bear a grudge. Don't put any Jew to shame. We would read that, if we, as don't be nasty. Don't be a jerk. But also rebuke the sinner. Tell people when they're doing wrong, but do it lovingly. Relieve a neighbor of his burden and help to unload his beast. Now, a lot of us, no one comes to church with their donkey paddle sacks full. So does that mean it's my job to help unload everybody's truck? I guess. How do we interpret some of this?
When people pull up at the door down here on Church Street and they're taking stuff down for a dinner or something, how many people stop and say, can I help you with that?
Yep,
Let me
right.
help you here.
So we know that we know that that's the right thing to do, even if the nature of it has changed somewhat in 3,000 years. The ones around gleaning and poverty, I think, are really important. Not to afflict an orphan or widow. Don't make somebody's life who's already had a hard time, don't make it more difficult. Try not to make anybody's life more difficult if you can do so. Don't reap the entire field. Things that made sense in their culture that might not affect us in quite the same way. I'm trying to put my garden to bed right now, and I'm thinking to myself, should I leave some tomatoes for some poor indigent folks that might wander by? That's not so much an issue that we're going to have in our culture.
About for animals. Do animals eat the tomatoes?
Oh, they eat them but they eat them before I can get to them.
Oh,
I think
yeah, okay. Well,
I've already helped them out.
take them off and throw them somewhere where you don't want the animals.
We do that too. Yeah. But a lot of that, you see that like in Ruth, when she originally goes to the field to glean the edges of the field that haven't been harvested. That was specifically meant so that it was kind of like a temporary soup kitchen. It was here's where food's going to be available. You can come to the farm and you're not going to get the best of it, but it's going to be what's left, and it's going to be left for you because it's a command from God.
Well, you have the devotionals that you put out at Christmas and Lent. That's from the gleaners.
Yes.
And that's what they if you've got excess stuff, you take to them and they find a purpose.
Yeah, that's their entire ministry. Well, I mean, they do other, but that's their primary ministry. Absolutely. Some of it is a little more difficult. There's a lot around how to farm for an agrarian society. It makes sense. Part of it is how to take care of the indigent and poor. Part of it is with the nature of identity and separation of things. Forbidden sexual relations seem very interesting. There's just a whole lot that I think it could be condensed into. But, these things were written, these were laws for a reason.
A lot of them are for cleanliness and dietary things and stuff. And that was, what was safe to eat and not safe. Pork got bad fast.
Right.
But don't eat it.
Shellfish is an abomination. Have you ever let shrimp sit on the counter for too long?
No. Shrimp's too expensive to do.
Shrimp is too expensive. That's fair. So the question that we run into, and perhaps we'll take more of a Reform Judaism stance on it, that some of these things were cultural. I wouldn't. Oh man, I just made some really nice pulled pork yesterday, smoked it and everything, put it right in the fridge. I'm not going to have to worry about it. I can eat it today. I can eat it tomorrow. Without refrigeration, you're going to run into some problems with pulled pork real quick. So does that mean, we shouldn't partake in it because this rule was written then? Or issues around relationships? Think about the difference in the nature of what marriage was at the time. Women were property. And there has to be very strict rules about sexual relations just in case, your property is damaged. I hate to say it that way, but it's a different cultural standard at the time. Kids were your property. They had to behave a certain way because they reflected some folks still, and to some degree I'm gonna back off before I make
What is a man's
where you at?
What number?
number 65?
65, let's see.
MAMZER.
Not very, June.
That's a good one. Let's look that up. Deuteronomy 23 is good. Deuteronomy 23:2.
Well,
Oh,
See, prohibited marriages and illegitimate children.
okay. An estranged person.
yeah, we would probably name that.
Oh, a person born as the result of certain forbidden relationships or incest.
We would name that probably as a bastard in our culture. Although that name has kind of lost its
Yeah.
not only would it be seen as inappropriate now, but also illicit unions aren't necessarily out of the ordinary.
Yeah, it's not synonymous with the traditional Western definition of illegitimacy,
Okay.
since it's not synonymous with that. It does not include children born to unmarried mothers.
Oh, thank you. So it's not the interpretation that we would necessarily have, but it would fit under those other illicit categories.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's not a word I knew. Thank you. But we see in so chapter 23 starts out this way. No one whose testicles are crushed or whose penis is cut off shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Those born of an illicit union shall not be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of their descendants shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of their descendants shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord, because they did not meet you with food and water on your journey out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you. Let the Lord your God refuse to heed Balaam. The Lord your God turn the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loved you. You shall never promote their welfare or their prosperity as long as you live. You shall not abhor any of the Edomites, for they are your kin. You shall not abhor any of the Egyptians, because you are an alien residing in their land. The children of the 3rd generation that are born to them may be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Are we checking our membership for Moabites and Amorites, and when we go through an agape committee and looking at the membership ranks,
All are welcome.
Are we-
What happened to that?
right?
Yeah,
So why can we say that all are welcome when this very clearly says who needs to be kept out?
Jesus gave us a moment law.
Okay.
Love one another.
So as Christians, many of us would agree and that the Christ somehow fulfilled the law. We run into issues as far as back as the 1st century with the Christians. Once the Gentiles started joining in, there was this big debate of how we even deal with this. Gentiles were joining in Jewish communities, coming to the well, this was happening during the Second Temple period as well, and Gentiles would have been allowed to enter into the outer court, which was the court of Gentiles. We just couldn't get any further in. But once we get into a rabbinical tradition, and we start, especially with Christ, to have these Gentile folks that are starting to follow this new reform of Judaism, which is really what Christ was trying to do. They're not really aware of Jewish law. They're not really aware of the mitzvot. How much do they have to follow? Because some of these things, they would be falling into categories where they would be rejected. But if they're joining in now, geez, what do we do with them? Well, the big argument would have been, what about the first one, right? Do they need circumcised? And Paul and Peter go back and forth about what needs done. And they kind of came to the conclusion that it is a new covenant. But it wasn't really established across the board. Probably a lot of what we have in the New Testament is trying to reconcile arguments that were still ongoing. Someone writing to say, oh, it's okay, we figured it out, it's all taken care of. Kind of the way we'd run a board report, right? Well, we've all decided that this is the way it's going to be. Not necessarily.
Not everybody has decided that.
Right.
But
For the sake of
sending votes.
right, but for the sake of what we're writing down and what we want in perpetuity, we'll say that we're all of one accord. Because doesn't that make it sound better? What else do we find? I think a lot of this also names the need to retain identity and to procreate in such a way that that identity is retained. That's why, you know, there's very clear lines about the Amorites or the Moabites. You know, stick with your people because we're already on our way to being destroyed, right? It's a lot, you're going to find a lot more insular culture when there is outside pressure, either to dissolve your community into the larger community, or when it's being forced, or when there's a falling out of population, right? So, well, you see this happening with the church right now, right? As the church in the United States is just in rapid decline, you have churches that are becoming more insular, that are becoming much more closed off. We have been for decades at this point. You know, we get surprised when people come in the door, and we think, oh, where are they sitting? What are they talking about? You know, should we welcome them in? And it's because we fear our identity. We fear a lack or a change of our identity. You see this throughout the development of Judaism, because this was, the ancient Near East was a place where every empire around was clamoring to get that property. Whether it was the Assyrians, or whether it was the Babylonians, or whether it was the Romans. And you see that in the development of this history as well. So even though we would say that the law was put together by Moses, that's the tradition, right? Some folks would argue that Moses never really even existed. He might have been an amalgamation of different people, different study for a different time. But we don't really have, even after the development of the law, we see in Scripture the Jewish people struggle to adhere to it. They keep losing it. They keep falling out of place with it. They keep trying to do their own thing. And I say they, I don't mean to, I want to be very careful, because I don't want to suggest that that's why we got the new covenant, because they kept failing. That's not what I'm saying at all. I think it's more of a story of human nature, that we just really struggle to follow rules. We're not great at it. We're great at making rules. We're just not great at following them. So we see as like the late 7th century BCE, in 2 Kings, we see Josiah right before the Babylonian exile. He finds some scrolls in the treasure rooms of the temple, and he takes them out, and this becomes the Deuteronomic reform. The previous kings had forgotten about the Torah as an oral tradition, and some scraps of it got written down. Josiah finds it, and he realizes that they've had these laws all the time and completely forgotten to follow them. So he does this Deuteronomic reform. Unfortunately, very shortly thereafter, they're wiped out and moved into exile during the Babylonian exile. From there on, it's basically the Jewish people trying to keep their identity in foreign lands and under foreign leadership. So once they come back from Babylon, once Cyrus of the Persians sends them back to Judah, to Jerusalem, they're allowed to follow Mosaic law, because at this point in time, it wouldn't have been the Torah. It's the kind of the precursor. It would have been begun to be written down. Some of it would have been written during the Babylonian exile. But you see basically the laws come through that Cyrus says, yes, you're allowed to follow these again. We get that a lot in Ezra and Nehemiah. After that, the Seleucid kings that were ruling over the ancient Near East, they granted Jews the right to govern. This is like 223, 187. But that really starts to flip. And we don't even see this in Scripture. We see this from Josephus in the Antiquity of the Jews. That all flipped when Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes, which was 157 to 164 BCE, he forbid ancestral law and worship. And that's when you get the rise of the Maccabees. The Maccabees developed the Hasmonean Empire, which was self-governing for some time. So it was an opportunity to reform and come back to Mosaic law and to follow these mitzvot again. But very shortly thereafter, you get the Romans that come in. Romans did a really good job. I know the Romans, we have a tendency to think of them as the bad guys just because of how they're portrayed in Scripture, right? But we get the Pax Romana. This is one of the empires that really did an amazing job of assimilation. And they were able to, at least for the early part of the empire, the decline of the Roman Empire is a different story. But they did so well with allowing people to continue to be who they were that they didn't rebel. If you tell someone you can't be yourself anymore, we're going to change everything about you, there's a better chance that they're going to stand up for themselves.
Right.
If you say, no, you can keep doing what you want, you can have your culture, you can have your laws, just make sure you keep paying us, it's going to be a lot easier to keep them under subjugation. So even though they are portrayed as the bad guys, and rightfully so, because it was still subjugation and marginalization, across the board, they're known as one of the better empires to be ruled by, at least in that period of time. And from there on, we're still in the Jewish people are still in diaspora after the Roman breaking down of Jerusalem up until post World War II, and now we got a whole new mess of problems relating to that. So you see the problem with that area, that geography has in so many ways defined the Jewish people, because it has been constant barrage of trying to erase their culture, of trying to assimilate their culture, of trying to take that property of just the area it's in and its resources and its accessibility to other empires throughout history. So you need rules. If you're going to remember who you are, you got to have some rules to remember who you are. And you see this development of the Torah primarily as a way to say, not only do we need to remember who we are, and here's the way to do it, but we're unique. All these other people that are trying to conquer us are, they have their own gods, but they're all contained in idols. Their gods are stone, their gods are bronze, their gods are metal. Our God can't be contained in these things. The only way we can remember our God is to follow the commands that God has given us. So you can see why the mitzvot are so important to the culture and the nature of this identity of the Jewish people, and how difficult it is for us to consider what we need to do with them. Because, hey, we follow the same God, right? But this is tough. Some of that stuff, I didn't even know the name of what it meant to follow it. Some of them are, people have different rules for things. 402 is interesting, that an uncircumcised person shall not eat of the specific heave offering, and the same applies to other holy things. This rule is inferred from the law of paschal offering by similarity of phrase, but is not explicitly set forth in the Torah. Traditionally, it has been learned that the rule that the uncircumcised must not eat holy things is an essential principle in the Torah and not enactment of the scribes. So there's not only what you need to do, but it's whether you're this type of person or whether you're that type of person. Some of them are what your identity is or what happened to you. You see that like eunuchs aren't allowed in the assembly of God, which we don't go around to all the guys in the congregation and say, hey, have you gotten the snip? You're not allowed in here. I can't imagine that conversation, right?
Peter.
One of the first converts to Christianity. So we see a shift of, although we read as well in Christ's teachings that some of his interpretation of the law was so radical that it offended the regular folk. That's why you get the Pharisees that are so against him, because he's reinterpreting the law in a way that they see as blaspheming, as sacrilege, as against what it is that they believe. But you also see that in every major world religion with most things. We've had splits in our denomination over whether we can use instruments in worship. So it makes sense that we'd argue about everything else. Too bad there's no mitzvot for that.
Oh, thank God there's no mitzvot.
Interesting. So a lack of law might be freeing, which to some degree is what Paul argues in Romans, and it's kind of what I talked about on Sunday, that the law doesn't impute righteousness as we understand it from a Christian perspective. It just lets us know what we're doing wrong. So freeing from the law allows us to follow a law of love, which we also don't do a great job with, but it's easier to not do a great job with it. So with the time that we have, I see that we just got a couple minutes. Is there anything in here that we could also name? I like how much the Nazarites have to do with grapes.
Yeah, I saw that. No, don't eat the skins or the seed of the grape or something like that.
Not only is it don't eat the skins, don't eat the kernels, don't eat dried, don't eat fresh. I mean, like they could have just said don't eat grapes.
Yeah.
I think that would cover it.
That would take out juice or wine or something.
Ah, yeah, okay.
Just say don't eat grapes.
Look how we look for the loophole.
Well, it's just like now. We had an HOA meeting for our condo association on Saturday. And they were talking about what you can do and what you can't do with putting things outside and this and that. And it's like, well, that's not what it says. It says that you can have a shepherd's hook for a plant. Well, you can't put a bird feeder on there, or you can't put a lantern or something. And people were getting so nitpicky and stuff. It's like, okay, I've had enough. I just want to go home.
That's what we do with the law. We draw it to such fine, and that's necessary because people keep breaking the law. So we have to define it in such a way that we need specialized occupations that just can tell us what the law is, which has happened in religion and in civil law.
So, yeah. That's why lawyers make so much money.
Yeah.
Did you go to school with Josh Garris?
Yeah.
He's running for board of education in Middle Ridge.
In Ridge. That's fun. That's
He's got the biggest signs out there.
So what do we do with these mitzvot? Are some worth following? Are some worth setting aside? Do we read them as cultural? Do we read them as God ordained? How should we approach the law as we find in the Torah, in the Pentateuch?
There are some we should keep and some we should read, but just not, what am I looking for?
Just aren't pertinent.
Yeah, they don't
Okay.
pertain to how we're living in this lifestyle.
And in this
In
day
this
and age.
Day and age, yeah.
Yeah, it's just.
Yeah, so it would definitely be cultural.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. So then this is going to put us in a stickier situation, because we agree that there's some that are antiquated culturally that we can set aside. I'm not gonna leave sheaves in my field so that folks can glean them. I'm not gonna plant one seed in my garden. I'm not gonna monoculture it. First of all, because science is against that as well. Monocultures are traditionally unhealthy, but that's not a system that they would have had before. They were trying to keep their seed pure from year to year, so that makes sense with their agricultural methods. So it could be right for them, but wrong for us. But most of those are prescriptive in business practices, in clothing and fashion, in safety and food safety. But some of these, I don't know. So let's see, like, how do we deal with the treatment of Gentiles? Love your neighbor, or love the stranger. Not to wrong the stranger in speech, not to wrong the stranger in buying or selling. Don't rip people off. Not to intermarry with Gentiles. Not to exact the debt of an alien. not to lend, or to lend to an alien at interest. And that we're actually, so if you read these laws literally, Jewish people are supposed to lend with interest, with usury, to Gentiles, but not to Jewish people themselves. And you saw this. Did you know that's the reason that a lot of Jewish folks are seen as bankers or good with money? Because Jewish folks couldn't lend with usury to other Jewish folks. Christians couldn't lend with usury to other Christians. But we could lend to Jewish folks and practice usury, and they could lend to us and practice usury. So that was often one of the jobs that were left, that were allowed to Jewish people. Like we went through historically, how Jewish folks for a long time weren't allowed to follow their own laws, their own traditional laws. So what was left of them were like banking jobs that were seen as less than at the time, which shows how occupations have shifted in prestige. But even now, Christians don't really follow some of these things. Love the stranger. Treat the foreigner like you would treat your family. You talk about
anybody about immigration.
I don't even say that word. But we're told very clearly throughout not only the Hebrew scriptures, but the New Testament, that you gotta welcome the stranger. You gotta love the alien, the poor, the indigent. And for the most part, those are kind of the rules that Christians set aside. We're much more, I truly believe, and here's my sermon, y'all. I truly believe that one of the reasons that Christianity is in a free fall in our country is because we as Christians are so all of our focus is on telling other people what to do.
Yeah,
And not treating each other the way we should be. We're trying to push through laws that say, no, you need to act the way that I think is right, or you need to do what I think you need to do. And it's less treating people with kindness, loving the stranger, taking care of the widow and the orphan. No wonder people don't want to be a part of this. And I'm not saying that it's all of us, right? But we certainly get wrapped in with the loudest voices.
That was one of Jesus' big ones.
Same problem. Right.
The stranger is yourself.
And we do terribly with that. I don't I don't want to leave it at that point, though. I don't want to leave us on a negative. So I think it would be worthwhile to say that there is life-giving words in these mitzvot, even in the ones that don't apply to us today. It was what allowed a society to succeed against overwhelming odds. It allowed a society to function safely. It allowed a society to function with a unique cultural identity that, name another culture that has lost the entirety of their geographic claims for centuries and still maintained a unique identity. You don't see that. You might have seen that with like the Gauls, as they developed into the Celts in Great Britain, but we're not really sure because most of the Gauls in Europe got wiped out by the Romans. So it's really difficult to name another culture that has done as well under the circumstances as Jewish folks, and the mitzvot were what allowed for it. So
this is part of the exegesis of knowing the New Testament, is
yes,
learning what was going on at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And this was Jesus' world. Jesus' world.
Absolutely.
And that was his religion. And we need to know what was going on.
Yeah, there's no way to read Hebrews, the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, there's no way to accurately read the book of Hebrews in the New Testament without a full understanding of Jewish culture in the first century. There's no way to approach it without that. Even a plain reading will get us way off track because we interpret it with our lenses. It doesn't make it it makes it more difficult. And perhaps that's why there's so many different interpretations and so much argument over what we're being told to do now. because, well, we know we got all these rules, but right off the bat, we're saying, well, not that one, maybe this one.
Well, I've read Hebrews and I certainly don't have a full understanding of what was going on
Yeah,
in the Old Testament, but it helps to know at least a little bit of it.
it does. Yeah. Well, and that's the beauty of exegesis, that historical critical method allows us to understand a little bit more of the culture, and therefore to understand the authorship and what truth we can take out of it today. That's a wonderful spot to stick. I appreciate that. So thank you for joining us. Join us again next Tuesday. You can find the Zoom link in our praises and prayers to go out to the congregation. If you're not getting it, send me an email. I'll be happy to forward that to you. If not, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in whichever way you're consuming this, and we'll get back to you. But thanks for being around with us today. Go in peace.